So, hi, I'm Tim Sullivan, and I'm here with Josh Seim, the author of the new book Bandage, Sort and Hustle, Ambulance Crews on the Front Lines of Urban Suffering. Josh is trained as an ethnographer and works as an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Southern California. In the book, Josh reimagines paramedicine as a frontline institution for governing urban suffering. Bandage, Sort and Hustle argues that the ambulance is part of a fragmented regime that is focused more on neutralizing hardship than on eradicating the root causes of agony. Whether by compressing lifeless chests on the streets or by transporting the publicly intoxicated into the hospital, ambulance crews handle suffering bodies near the bottom of our social structures. Josh draws on field observations, medical records, and his own expertise as a novice emergency medical technician to present a labor-centric model for understanding the frontline governance of down and out populations. Josh, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So what can you tell us about the motivating factors for writing your book and who you really wanted to target as your key audience?
Oh yeah, good question. So this is a cover of the book, by the way. And so, the book is an effort to think about basically what the role is, what the role that ambulance plays in the American city. So it's primarily a piece of urban sociology, medical sociology, and the sociology of work. And I've written it for a general audience in mind, but also for social scientists and sociologists in particular who might find this book useful in their classes in urban sociology and work and in medical sociology, and perhaps even an introduction to sociology classes. But I wrote for kind of a general audience and also wanted to speak to the workers that I not only specifically study, but also just ambulance workers and healthcare workers more generally.
Mm-hmm. And what made you focus on the ambulance as a site?
Yeah, so I wanted to study the governance of urban suffering. I mean, I guess that's kind of like a reverse engineered kind of justification for why I did this particular case. I mean, I was interested in healthcare, I was interested in inequality, didn't really know what much of that meant in terms of this book. When I initially started this project, I thought it was going to be a research project on trauma, on injury. So trauma meaning kind of in medical terms about kind of physical injury. And so I went into the field with a proposal to basically study the labor of trauma work. And I realized very early on in my fieldwork that was an inappropriate framing. And the people I was shadowing told me that was an inappropriate framing because most of the work that they do is not actually trauma work. I mean, there is a significant amount of trauma work that ambulance crews do. They respond to gunshot wounds, motor vehicle accidents. They do a lot of trauma work. But most of their work is not trauma. Most of the cases they respond to are not trauma. And most of them are not as severe as perhaps the Hollywood cliches of ambulances make them out to be. And so I had to step back pretty early on in my research to think about what the ambulance is a case of, suggesting that it's a case of a kind of trauma institution really didn't make all that much sense. And so I had to think about what it is a case of more generally. And I came to the conclusion, throughout the field work that this is a really an ideal case for studying the governance of suffering more generally. Suffering both in terms of course, when it appears in its traumatic forms and in its quote unquote legit forms as recognized by emergency medicine, but also in its so-called non-legit forms as recognized by emergency medicine in terms of the types of calls that crews are typically responding to, which are usually framed as non-emergencies. So taking people to the hospital for so-called non-life-threatening these getting prescription refills and things like that. So I wanted to capture all the complexity that ambulances are responding to. And so I, through my fieldwork, began to articulate it as an institution for governing urban suffering.
So can you say more about what you mean by governance of urban suffering?
Sure, yeah, I should probably say what I mean about urban suffering too. So, in no way am I trying to suggest that people who dwell in cities live in like absolute or permanent misery. I mean, they don't, right? There's actually a lot of sociological research that suggests that people who live in cities actually tend to be happier than those who do not live in cities. And the public health scholarship mentions something called an urban health advantage. So I'm not denying any of that stuff in this book. But all human settlements contain suffering. And we've long known that suffering in the city tends to concentrate towards the bottom of complex hierarchies, economic and racial hierarchies. And we've known this for a long time. That's not really the contribution of the book to make that point, because we've known about this from the writings of Frederick Ingalls, to W.B. Du Bois, to Jane Addams, the Chicago School of Sociology, and onward. As I say in the book, suffering seems to obey a kind of social gravity. Something in the cosmos tends to pull it towards the bottom of complex hierarchies. And I'm particularly interested in the governance of urban suffering. How do states and state-regulated institutions, so including things like nonprofit organizations and also things like hospitals, but also police departments, how they tend to manage those populations that bear the brunt of suffering at the bottom of that hierarchy, or tend to bear it at the bottom of that hierarchy, either by aiding populations, by helping them, by punishing populations, by processing them into objects to know and direct, or in some cases, just neglecting those populations. And so I wanted to, and I think the ambulance is a good case for studying the governance of urban suffering, because it's, you know, its explicit kind of manifest mission is one about governing urban suffering, right? Its explicit mission is to treat and transport critically ill and injured populations, regardless of where they're spread across the city. My research shows that the ambulance actually plays a much broader role than that, but I think it's a good starting point to suggest that it is a promising case for studying the governance of those populations that bear the brunt of hardship in the city.
So I want to understand what you mean by governance a little bit more. Could you just talk about, so it's about, when I hear governance, I think regulation, about control, and is that, there's more to it than that, obviously, but could you say what more there is to the governance?
Yeah, I just simply mean how state or state delegated institutions, how they manage those populations that bear the brunt of suffering. So I think it necessitates a recognition of problems, right? That there are state agencies that recognize various problems, be they medical problems, criminal problems, and of course those are constructions in and of themselves, and we critique those things. But the state, nevertheless, in a series of institutions, recognize a series of hardships and problems: poverty, crime, illness. And the question is, how does a fragmented state, you know, splintered across not only different state institutions and agencies, but also across a number of delegated institutions, nonprofit and for-profit organizations that often hold contracts with local governments to manage those various so-called social problems towards the bottom of these hierarchies. And so it's a very, certainly there is a controlled dimension to it, but for me, it's more about what is the reaction that the state and these state delegated institutions are imposing. So that's why I frame it in terms of either aiding these populations by punishing these populations, or simply by kind of processing them into objects to know and direct, or in some cases, like I said, even neglecting these populations. I think states that recognize these problems and then choose to neglect them, or state agencies that choose to neglect them, I think that we should frame that also as a form of governance of these populations.
Right, so it's the intersection of all these different interests that coalesce around the ambulance itself that makes it a site.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. How did you go about studying the site of the ambulance?
Yeah, I draw on 3 sources in this book. So the first thing I did was a year of ride-along observations, the kind of typical participant observation, where most of my time was spent shadowing ambulance crews, sitting in the backs of ambulances with them, following them along on their shifts. And then I also spent a significant amount of time as part of this during my ride-along period, hanging out with field supervisors. So these are middle managers. They drive around in SUVs and kind of patrol the 911 ambulance fleet. I also got a chance to attend some management meetings. So that was my first year of field work as basically a ride-along. And then I shifted position in the second year of my field work. I worked as a novice emergency medical technician. So I should make a distinction here, at least at the organization I studied and in the state of California, the distinction between emergency medical technicians and paramedics. So paramedics are the more trained of these parties, are the ones that are doing like all the deep clinical interventions, are the ones that are starting IVs and doing, you know, pushing most of the medications. And EMTs are really there to, for the most part, assist the duties of paramedics. There's a lot of EMTs that kind of hate that description, and I understand why they hate it, but as an EMT, I can say it's fair to conclude that most of their job is to assist and augment the duties of paramedics. Paramedics are calling all the major medical clinical shots, and EMTs are there to assist. And so that really kind of translates for the most part of the EMTs doing most of the driving and most of the lifting, and paramedics are doing most of the paperwork and most of the patient care. But that's a pretty cold distinction. Paramedics certainly drive ambulances, and EMTs certainly do patient care, but that's generally the division of labor. And so I worked as an EMT, so really as somebody who's assisting the duties of paramedics, so I did a lot of driving the ambulances and lifting of bodies and things like that. And so I did that for 9 months, but it was about 3 months of training and preparation for that. So it was about 2 years of field work overall. First as a ride along, then as an EMT. And when I became an EMT, I did a lot to, as I say in the book, kind of bend the ethnographic gaze back onto myself to make sense of my own kind of shifting dispositions and subjectivities as I was, quote unquote, becoming an EMT. And then as a third source of data, I also draw on over 100,000 medical records. These are patient care reports that are completed by ambulance workers. I treat them as kind of being like receipts of labor, because these are documents completed by workers in the field, where they're documenting patient demographics, as well as logging the labor that they performed. They're documenting all the interventions that they made, and then they're writing these little open-ended narratives in their own voice, kind of summarizing the event as it occurred. So I have this large quantitative data set of medical records that I look at as well.
All right, I'm going to move on to a couple of other questions. So the title of the book is Bandage, Sort, and Hustle. So can you talk a little bit about each of those elements, the bandaging, the sorting, and the hustling of the bodies that the ambulance workers are doing?
Yeah, for sure. So the book has these two basic goals in mind, right? The first is to reimagine the ambulance as an institution for governing urban suffering. And then the second goal is to advance this labor-centric approach to studying governing of suffering populations more generally. And in answering, in particular, in addressing that first goal, I argue that the ambulance helps to contribute to the governance of urban suffering in 3 ways. First, by bandaging suffering bodies. And by this, I'm just referring to how ambulance crews and how their labor amounts to offering largely superficial and simple solutions to deep and complicated structural problems in a capitalist and racist society like the United States. I also argue that ambulance crews help to sort suffering bodies, helping to distribute them in part in their interactions with nurses and police, helping to distribute suffering populations across an array of institutions, some of them contradicting each other. And then finally, I argue that the ambulance helps to hustle suffering bodies, helping to rush them through periods of intervention, not necessarily rushing them toward interventions, but rushing them through periods of interventions, often doing this in the name of organizational efficiency, or in the case of the company I studied, in the name of profit. And so these are all different processes by which, these are the different, I guess, mechanisms by which ambulance contribute to the governance of urban suffering, by bandaging their bodies, by sorting their bodies, and then also by hustling their bodies.
So I want to thank you, Josh Seim. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the book. The book is Bandage, Sort, and Hustle. It's on sale both in print and ebook formats. And please consider purchasing it online through bookshop.org or IndieBound to support independent booksellers. You can find the link to those on the UC Press website. Josh, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.